This is the Resistance Report, March 17th, 2017. Good evening. We're now almost completing 8 weeks of the Trump administration. 8 weeks. Now, every week is like a dog year when it comes to the Trump administration. That is, it feels like it's been 8 years, not 8 weeks. And it feels like it's been 8 years because Donald Trump has caused so much anxiety, created so much commotion, caused so much dread. And that's part of his technique, and that's one thing I want to talk about tonight. The purpose of these get-togethers is to pull the various strands of what is happening together, to show you the pattern. And that is what I am intending to do. I spent most of this week in Washington, D.C., where I caught up with a lot of people who are right in the middle of the maelstrom, Republicans as well as Democrats, and I'll bring you up to date on that as well. But first of all, what is the unifying theme? Looking back on the last few weeks, what can we say is Trumpism, if there is such a word, all about? Well, I think the only way to explain it is in terms of unnecessary cruelty. You heard me. Unnecessary, gratuitous cruelty. Cruelty in a variety of directions. In fact, there are 4 major points I want to bring together. One is Donald Trump's new budget. Now, as you know, the new budget expands the military by 10%, $54 billion. Now, because the military is such a large part of the budget, that 10% expansion, that $54 billion, is huge and requires a lot of cuts elsewhere in the budget to accommodate that $54 billion. He's also expanding Homeland Security, including his wall. That is also going to cost billions of dollars, and that means cuts elsewhere in the budget. And where are the cuts coming? He is imposing unprecedented cuts in issues that people really believe in, need, in programs that, in fact, a lot of poor people depend on. Low-income housing, job training, food assistance, legal services, help to distressed rural communities, nutrition for mothers and infants, funds to keep poor families warm in the winter, even Meals on Wheels for the disabled. Now, what we ought to be aware of, these cuts come at a time when more Americans than ever before are in poverty. And although a disproportionate number of those Americans in poverty are African American and Latino, in terms of absolute numbers, the majority of people in poverty are white. Many people in poverty came and fell into poverty from the working class. In other words, many of these people are, or were, or will be, maybe, one day, possibly, Trump voters. What Trump is doing by cutting all these programs is making many of his voters even less secure, but he's also imposing extraordinary cruelty on a lot of the most vulnerable people in the United States. For what reason? For what reason? To pay for the biggest hike in military spending since the 1980s. For what reason? Why do we have to do this right now? Are we being imperiled in some way? That 1980s military hike? Well, Ronald Reagan told us the Soviets were building up their military, so we had to catch up. There is no indication at all that Russians or anybody else are building up their military forces, requiring us to go 10% larger. We already have a larger military budget than the next 7 military budgets in the world put together. Do we face some new national emergency that somehow we hadn't heard about? No. In other words, all of these cuts in programs for the poor, in things that people need, who are lower middle class, working class, and poor, many people who could fall into poverty. Everything that is being cut to subsidize an expansion of the military for absolutely no reason at all at a time when we have more poor and 1 in 5 of our children in this country is poor. That is called, in my book, unnecessary cruelty. Unnecessary and cruel. Number two, consider Trump and his enablers in the GOP and their plan to repeal the Affordable Care Act and replace it. They say repeal and replace. We heard earlier this week from the Congressional Budget Office that what that meant is 14 million Americans losing their health insurance coverage next year, and by 10 years from now, in fact less than 10 years, in 2026, 24 million Americans would lose their coverage under Trump Care. And we ought to call it for what it is. It's Trump Care. They wanted to call Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Well, this is Trump Care. And why is this necessary? Why is Trump and Paul Ryan, the House Speaker, why are they doing this? They're doing this to give $600 billion in tax breaks over the next decade to the wealthiest Americans. $600 billion in tax cuts over the next decade to wealthiest Americans. Why is that necessary now? Are wealthy Americans suddenly stricken? Are wealthy Americans somehow poorer than they were before? No. In fact, the top 1% is better off now than they have ever been in the history of this country. The top 1% is raking in more money than the top 1% has ever raked in any civilization in history. The top 1%, just look at their stock portfolios, doing gangbusters on the expectation that Trump is going to lower corporate taxes and reduce regulations on corporations, and the top 1% have over 40% of all of the shares of stock in the United States. They're doing gangbusters. Do they need a $600 billion tax cut from Donald Trump, courtesy of throwing, over the next 10 years, 24 million people off of health care? Well, the answer is obviously no. This is called unnecessary cruelty. What about the federal budget deficit? Is this necessary for the budget deficit? No. This whole plan doesn't do squat to reduce the budget deficit. In fact, the so-called repeal and replacement of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, it actually reduces the budget deficit by $337 billion over the next 10 years. That may sound like a lot. My friends, that is a small fraction of the national debt. What we're getting instead is the largest redistribution of resources, income, assets, wealth in history, from the poor and the lower middle class and the working class to the rich, at a time in the nation's history when the top 1% have never, ever had it so good. What is the purpose here? What's the underlying necessity? There is none. It's gratuitous. Again, back to my theme, this is unnecessary cruelty. It has a cruel impact on the most vulnerable members of our society. And it is not justifiable under any condition, certainly not now. There's nothing requiring it. Number three, Trump is now banning Syrian refugees and slashing the total number of refugees this year by more than half. Now, this comes at a time when the world is experiencing its worst refugee crisis since World War II. Right now. If you look at what is happening in the Middle East, and we are not completely innocent in that, if you look at what's happening in Central America, look at what is happening in Somalia, Yemen, various places around the world, it is the worst crisis for refugees who are being hounded, starved, under gunfire, many children, that the world has seen since World War II. The United States, we have a statement on our Statue of Liberty. And that statement on the Statue of Liberty, that poem, says, give me your poor, you're tired, your people around the world yearning to breathe free. Give me, in other words, the people who are refugees, who are needy. Other countries are doing much more than we are doing, and they're much smaller than we are. And Donald Trump is now saying, no more Syrian refugees at all. And we're slashing by half the total number of refugees we're taking in. He says it's because why? Terrorism? He's afraid of terrorism? Well, let me just tell you, your odds of being killed by lightning are greater than your odds of being killed in a terrorist attack by immigrants, by foreigners. There's been no terrorist attacker in the United States who has come from Syria, or for that matter, from any of the 6 nations that the travel ban now reflects. In fact, an internal White House report yesterday analyzed roughly 90 cases of suspected or confirmed foreign-born terrorists and found that most of them had embraced extremist ideology after they arrived in the United States, not before. Do you get my point? There's absolutely no justification for any of this, particularly at a time when we have the world's greatest refugee crisis since World War II. This is cruel. This is unnecessary cruelty. And finally, number 4, that is, Trump is rounding up undocumented immigrants in the United States, helter-skelter. No longer, and don't believe for a moment that there are priorities going after criminals. No. We know too much now. There are too many accounts of families being broken up, including people who have been productive members of our society for decades, young people who have been here since they were toddlers, so-called dreamers. They are also, many of them are also falling under this dragnet. And why is Donald Trump doing this? Why is he changing the priorities that we had under President Obama? Is it so necessary to have this kind of helter-skelter dragnet that unleashes ICE immigration enforcement? These actions, by the way, come at a time when unemployment is down to record levels, when the actual rate of crime is going down and has gone down dramatically in the United States. We have fewer undocumented workers in the United States today than we had 10 years ago. So what is the justification for this cruelty? There is no justification whatsoever. There is no reason for this cruelty, these harms that are being imposed. So here we have, again, Trump's budget. We have Trump Care. We've got his refugee policy. We've got what he's doing to undocumented workers in the United States. There is no reason for any of this. There is no justification for any of this, and it's all being done in a way that hurts, harms the most vulnerable people on the planet. This is the theme that connects everything that Trump is doing. He's embarking on an orgy of cruelty for absolutely no reason. And this is profoundly immoral. That is, if a society has got to do things that are cruel, but must do them for its own survival, maybe then, there is an argument that it has to. But Donald Trump is embarking on this cruelty for no reason. There's no national emergency. Not only is this profoundly immoral, but it is morally incumbent on all of us to do what we can to stop it. Now, there are reasons to think and reasons to believe that maybe he will not succeed. And I hope, I can't assure you, but I can hope with you that he won't. For example, his budget, the budget that he just submitted, that cruel budget, that increases military by 10% and cuts everything else for people who are vulnerable in the United States, that budget cannot simply go through with a majority of Senate Republicans, because there is a law that was passed by the Senate in 2011. And that law says that any budget that expands military spending or other discretionary spending, any proposal beyond very rigid caps put in that law in 2011, has got to not only pass by 51 votes in the Senate, it's got to pass by 60. It's got to overcome a filibuster. And the Democrats can easily and have enough votes to filibuster this budget to death. That's good news. And if you make sure to let your members of Congress know that they have to vote no, whether they are Democrat or Republican, that will help. Meanwhile, the Republican plan to replace Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care Act, well, that is running into a lot of problems. A lot of Republicans are saying, I don't like it. Some are saying, I don't like it because I don't want to replace the Affordable Care Act at all. This replacement looks too much like Obamacare. Other Republicans know full well that the people who are going to be hurt by what is going on are in their own districts, in their own states. There are people who were on, are on, and will lose their Medicaid. And some of those Republicans are beginning to think, well, maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe this is bad for my constituents. Maybe I will be hurt in the next election. And so we know that there is in the Republican Party a lot of ferment, a lot of unhappiness. Hopefully enough to stop this. The Muslim ban, and it is a Muslim ban, let's not mince words about it. It was already found to be a Muslim ban, has already been stopped by a district court because the judge found there's really no difference between this new version and the old version. All of the evidence points to the fact that this is a ban on Muslims. It violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution. And it's already been held up. And hopefully the courts will stop it like they stopped the first version of Trump's Muslim ban. So why is Trump doing all of this if, in fact, a lot of this is being slowed down or stopped? I don't want to sound harsh here, but I think he is imposing or trying to impose unnecessary cruelty because it makes him look even stronger, more brutal. It enforces his image as a strongman. This has always been the weapon, the psychological weapon used by tyrants and dictators. When they want to take over a democracy, one thing they do is look like they are tough and brutal, and brutality is one of their techniques. Unnecessary cruelty is what they want to project. In Washington, I saw a lot of people and met a lot of people who were frantic, who looked at what was happening and what is happening under Donald Trump and were close enough to it in the various agencies or on Capitol Hill or staffers on Capitol Hill or people who had been in and around politics for years, or part of the foreign policy establishment under Democrats and Republicans. And what I hear from all of them, it's even worse than you think. Because we see the details. We see what is being sacrificed in terms of the institutions of our democracy that are actually quite fragile. Here in Washington, we count on a professional civil service. Many of them are heading for the doors. We count on the rule of law, and it's being abridged in so many ways. We count on a president who says things that are sane and doesn't insult a former president. So many people in Washington told me that they cannot believe what Donald Trump is sticking to, the story about Barack Obama wiretapping him or whatever he did. Now Trump is saying it's surveillance, but Trump doesn't know what he's talking about, changes his story a little bit every day, but is sticking to the notion that Obama did something. People in Washington close to the institutions of government find this even more appalling than you may find it. It's insulting. It's demeaning. So I urge you again not to normalize what's going on. This is not normal. In fact, I talked to some Republicans who said this is beyond the old left-right Republican Democratic debates and contests we used to have. This is about democracy. This is about holding on to our democracy. So don't normalize. Number two, do not escape or try to escape from this. I understand the urge. It's hard to read the newspapers every day. It's hard to go through this. It's been 8 weeks. It feels like 8 years. How can we continue? Well, I urge you not to try to escape, because ultimately there is no escape from this. And thirdly, I urge you not to succumb to exhaustion and burnout. Does that sound familiar? I urge you not to normalize or to escape or to become exhausted and burned out, but to do what many of you are doing, in fact, a vast number of you are doing, and that is be tenacious. Stick to it. Continue to organize and mobilize. You're having a big effect. I was amazed the number of people I ran into in Washington who are either working for, and I talked to actually a couple of members of Congress, and they said to a person, we are getting so much telephone calls, so many telephone calls, so much mail. At our town meetings, you can't believe what's going on. This uprising is what is keeping those people in Washington from doing what they would otherwise do, many of them, particularly Republicans, and that is just follow Trump. It's your backbone that is giving them backbone to stand up to this tyranny. So keep it up. And now your questions. Sonia Levison, Trump's budget and Trump care both hurt Trump voters bigly. When, if ever, will they realize that? Sonia, I think they will realize it, but don't forget, Donald Trump is a con man. He's a huckster. He will use everything at his disposal to try to convince them that they're actually doing fine, and I would expect that maybe, I don't know, 6 months from now, do you think? 8 months, maybe a year, they will discover that nothing he has promised is bearing fruit. Cindy Alvarez, I keep hearing Obamacare is in a death spiral and can't be sustained. Is that true? Cindy, it's not true. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office on Monday said it was absolutely untrue. It is perfectly sustainable. That mythology is being perpetrated by Trump and a lot of Republicans. Mark Ritchie. Paul Ryan says the House could vote on Trump care as early as Tuesday. Do you think it will pass in the House? Well, Mark, The Hill, which is an outlet that reports on what's going on Capitol Hill, reports that 18 House Republicans say they will not vote for it. About 20 to 25 are deeply disturbed. They haven't made a decision. I think it's going to be very close. The Senate, there is a better shot at stopping it altogether. 4 senators have said that they don't like it, I think, and they're all Republicans. The Democrats will not come on board. I believe that it's going to be stopped. Peter Holmes. I understand 41 Senate Democrats are filing a lawsuit to challenge Trump's violation of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution and use discovery to subpoena his tax records. Do you think that a court will grant them, you're talking about these 41 Democratic senators, standing to sue? Peter, it's a good question. I think that they might have standing to sue. I think a court could find them standing to sue because the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, says no high office holder should take anything, any gift or anything from a foreign government. Now, obviously, Trump is taking a lot from foreign governments, directly and indirectly, unless Congress acts. So I think the standing of these Democrats is based upon the fact that they are not going to have any opportunity to act. Jennifer Albin, why is Trump's budget dismantling almost all government-sponsored research? How does this make America great again? Jennifer, it doesn't. In fact, it is not just cruel, but it's bonkers. It is stupid. Without research, how can we, because basic research is not being done by companies. Indeed, it's part of Trump's assault on the truth. In other words, if you don't like the truth, if you don't want facts, not only do you go after the sources of truth, that is, investigative reporters, journalists, all those outlets, but you also go after science funding. That's what Trump is doing. This is what dictators do. Last question. Joanne York, why is all this happening so fast? Replacing the Affordable Care Act, the Trump budget, Trump's crazy insistence that he is right about President Obama spying on him. Well, it is happening a lot. It's happening very fast. I think that Donald Trump is doing, again, this is a ploy we have seen before by tyrants. What they want to do is create huge amounts of turbulence, a huge amount of disturbance, anxiety. Because what they do by creating so much turbulence, creating so much conflict, so much anxiety, is they subconsciously, psychologically make people want to support a strong man who will lead them out of the turbulence. Which is why we, all of us, in the resistance, have got to be strong and smart enough to communicate clearly what Donald Trump is doing. Why it's wrong, why it's hurtful, why it's cruel, why it's unnecessary. By the way, 2 books to recommend very quickly. One is The Future of Democracy. This is a book I read this weekend by Steve Zolno. It kind of looks at where democracy has come from and what the future of democracy is. I recommend it. It's a good read. Regent Press. And finally, here's another one, The Psychology of Dictatorship. This is by Fathali Morgendam, and it comes from and is published by the American Psychological Association. It's interesting. This is an absolute psychological analysis of dictatorships. How is it that people succumb to dictatorships? Historically, what do we know? Good reading. It's been a hard week for many of you, I know. It's been exhausting. But I urge you to look at the one and biggest silver lining, and that is that the people are speaking. There is more involvement, more political engagement, more understanding of what's going on than I have seen in the last 50 years. We are part of an uprising that will take back our democracy and thereby our economy. Keep the faith. Have a great weekend. I'll see you Monday.